And this is why Jesus has to come. You think Jesus is going to come when his church is doing his job? Jesus has to come because his church ain't doing the job that he commissioned the church to do. When you have the Vatican saying that that members of Sodom can be witnesses to a baptism, and they can be godparents, and they can be involved in witnessing a baptism. So you'll have two men in a church, husband and husband, smiling as a baby is baptized, and that's okay? When you have that sort of thing, how can you say with confidence that the church that Christ built is doing the job that Christ commissioned the church to do? As in the days of Noah. Yes. Why did God do a flood? He did a flood because he had to start over. Because humanity was in the depths of evil. And what does it say in the book of Genesis? The earth was filled with violence. And what did God tell Noah? One of the most profound verses in the Bible. What did God tell Noah? I regret making man. Oh! That hits me in the heart every time. That God could regret something. That God can regret something. I regret making man. The flesh of man has become corrupt. This is what God tells Noah. I regret making humans. And I have to start over because you guys aren't doing your jobs. You guys are not advancing justice. You guys are not advancing mercy. You guys are advancing just the depths of horror. You guys are committing crimes. You guys are not looking after the most vulnerable amongst us. And so God started over, and he said, I'm going to set up a church. Noah, you're the Pope. You're the priest. You have your 3 sons and their wife. Start over. Each one of your sons has a wife. You have a wife. Start over. Here we go. Repopulate the earth. And the earth got repopulated. And you know what happened? The whole world fell into paganism. So God said, okay, I'm going to go to the Semitic world. Went to the Hebrews. Told them to build a temple. They had a temple. And what happened? That temple got overtaken by what? Evil. Evil. And so God said, okay. Gotta leave the tent of Shem. Shem, you're out of the tent. Japheth, you're in the tent. I'm going to give the church now to the Europeans. Christendom. So you had Japheth. And what does it say? What does Noah say to his sons? He says, blessed be the God of Shem. And may God enlarge Japheth. Meaning the Europeans will be a people of empire. And may Japheth dwell in the tent of Shem. Meaning the temple of Shem. And that's what happened. And you had the Vatican. And what does St. Paul say to the Jews in the book of Acts? When they rioted against him, he said, I will go to the Gentiles and they will listen to me. And that is what St. Paul did. He went to the Gentiles. And we got the Vatican. We got Constantinople. We got Moscow. And what happened? The Vatican went to Sodom and Renaissance paganism. Constantinople got overtaken by the Arab Arians, the Turkish Unitarians, I should say. The Muslims took it over and crushed it. And Constantinople had its own corruption. What do we have? Who's fighting Sodom? Out of all of Christendom, who's fighting Sodom? The Africans and the Russians. That's who's fighting Sodom. Not the Vatican. The Vatican is saying members of Sodom can witness a baptism. They can be godparents. Moscow's fighting Sodom. And what happened? You had the first Rome. And in the Second Ecumenical Council, the church said Constantinople's the second Rome. We had the first Rome, that got overtaken by Sodom. You had the second Rome, that got overtaken by Islam. What's the third Rome? It's not America. It's Moscow. Moscow is the third Rome. Russia is the third Rome, everybody. It's the third Rome. I know, there's a lot of messed up things about Russia. I know Russians have done messed up stuff. I know. But I believe that God will do something to bring Russia fully into the fold of Christ. And by that, I mean fully out of the residue of the evils of Lenin that are still there and into the fold of Christ. And you know, and do you know what else I think? I think that in the future, the people in Israel, the Jewish people, will be in such torment and such horror. And the Bible tells us, I think in Zechariah somewhere, the Old Testament tells us that 2/3 of Jerusalem will be wiped out. And I think that Israel will be put through such horror that the people will beg for a Messiah. And what does St. Paul tell us? What does St. Paul tell us? He says the Messiah will not come until the children of Israel ask for the Messiah to come. And I believe that there will be a cleansing of the Jewish people. I think there will be a cleansing of the Jewish people. And by that I mean there will be a redemption of the Jewish people. Not all of them, but a remnant of them in the end. And I think that the Russians and the Jews will unite together in some sublime spiritual manner. And the Vatican, how do I see the Vatican? What do I see in the future of the Vatican? I see flames and destruction. That's what I see. Not in the sense that I'm a prophet, but this is just what I foresee based on my own intuition. Could be wrong, but I think that the future of the Vatican is flames and destruction, just like in 1527, but probably worse. Who will do the destruction? I don't know. Could be the Turks, could be the Germans, could be both. We'll see. 1527, the sacking of the Vatican was done by mainly Germanic Protestants. We'll see. We will see. But God creates and his creation turns against him. God creates a temple and the temple turns against him. God creates a church and the church turns against him. And this is the reality that we have to live with. But it's up to us not to be docile to the point that we fall into indiscriminate obeisance and submission to evil. We cannot say, oh, Francis said it's okay, cross-dressers can be in the church and they can be witnesses, and we can't sit there and be docile to that sickness. Oh, well, they changed the catechism and now they say death penalty is wrong. We cannot say, oh, well, I have to be obedient. I have to be obedient. That is not the mind of someone who wants truth. That is the mind of someone who is a zombie. I believe, and currently I'm writing a paper on this. I believe that in the future, the world will witness the extermination of the Semitic race. And what do I mean by the extermination of the Semitic race? Well, the Semitic world consists of who? Arabs and Jews. Arabs can be classified as Syrians, Lebanese. These are all classified as Arabs. And what happens in that film is that the Middle Eastern population in England is wiped out because they're tired. The people in Britain are tired of dealing with them. They're tired of the terrorism that comes from that population, and so they just wipe them out. And the Semitic world also consists of the Jews. So you have the Jews and you have the Arabs. And the Jews and the Arabs are both, in a way, they're both hated. You have the vicious anti-refugee sentiment in Europe. You have a lot of anti-Arab sentiment in Israel. And then on the other side, you have this vicious hatred against the Jews. And you have people who want to wipe the Jews out. Not just Muslims, but you have European right-wing fanatics who want to wipe out the Jews. They want to kill the Jews. And I believe in the future, the world will see horrific violence on both sides. Horrific violence against Syrian refugees in Europe and in Turkey. And the Turks really hate the Syrian refugees as well. Turks are not Semitic people for the most part. They are mainly an Indo-European people. I'm not talking about people in Central Asia. I'm talking about people in Anatolia. They're very Indo-European. Their descendants are Anatolian Indo-Europeans. And they are very racist against the Syrian refugees. And I think eventually there's going to be a genocide. I heard a far-right ideologue, an Iranian-American far-right ideologue, I forgot his name, Jason Giordani. You can look him up. Jason Giordani. He was a professor, and the university that he worked for fired him because they found out that he was a far-right ideologue. But Jason Giordani made a prediction, I believe back in 2017. And he said, in the future, in Europe, Hitler will be seen no differently from Napoleon. He will be seen as another Napoleon, a great European military conqueror. And all of his crimes will either be ignored or they will be seen as just things that we accept, and we can accept those bad things with the good things about Hitler. And the bad things about Hitler will simply be generalized as just a sins of another military conqueror. Alexander the Great, Napoleon, the British Empire, etc., etc. The Third Reich will be seen as just another European empire. And he said that in the next 30 years or so, the currency in Germany will have Hitler's face on it. Now, he could be completely wrong. But I believe, and if you look at what other people have said, for example, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis Varoufakis is a liberal. He's a part of the left. He considers himself a Marxist. And Yanis Varoufakis is a very respected analyst when it comes to the EU. He worked for the European Union. He knows a lot about the European Union. He's written books on the European Union. And Yanis Varoufakis was the Greek finance minister for a number of years until he resigned. And Yanis Varoufakis gives a similar warning. Now, Jason Giordani didn't give a warning. He said it as if it was a good thing, that one day Hitler will be praised. And Jason Giordani also stated that in the future, the refugees will be put into camps. He said that's the future of the refugees in Europe. They will be put into camps. And Yanis Varoufakis stated in one of his books called it's called "And the Weak Suffer What They Must." And Yanis Varoufakis warns that there is a possibility of Europe becoming fascist again. And he said that if we do not fix the problem in the EU, if we do not contain, or if we do not maintain the integrity of the European Union, that there is a chance that the EU or that Europe will break down and turn to fascism. And he said, do not think that the evils of the past won't come back. I believe they will. Genghis Khan in Mongolia. Genghis Khan was a mass murderer. Is a mass rapist. How many women did Genghis Khan rape? How many women did the Mongolians rape? How many Chinese women did the Mongolians rape? And you can look at modern day books today about Genghis Khan. And what do the modern day books say about Genghis Khan? We should not judge history by modern day standards. And they also say that what the Huns did and what the Mongols did, the crimes that they committed, were exaggerated by the Europeans. And who is to say that the same view will not develop towards Adolf Hitler in the future? I'm not talking about in the next 5 years. I'm talking about maybe in the next 30 years, if the world is still in existence. Perfect example. Hamas did the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And you have teenagers praising Hamas. That should scare you. You have teenagers praising Hamas. You have thinkers praising Hamas. Hell, you have Western Jews refusing to call Hamas terrorists. Have you seen the video of Jeremy Corbyn arguing with Piers Morgan? And Piers Morgan asks him like 100 times, are Hamas terrorists? And what does Jeremy Corbyn do? He refuses to call them terrorists. Now, I remember, you see, I am quite familiar with the pro-Israel, pro-Palestine world. I'm quite familiar with it because I grew up in it. My father is a Zionist. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I also am Zionist in the same way that he's a Zionist. I don't believe in far-right Zionism or anything like that, but I believe that the Jews deserve a state, and they have a right to the state. And I believe that Israel is a Jewish state. They went through the Holocaust. The world doesn't like them. They should have a state of their own. I don't see what the issue with that is. But my father was very active in the pro-Israel world. My father was very, very active. And I remember people who were pro-Palestine back in the early 2000s were seen as fringe. They were seen as a fringe. That's a fringe. People who sympathized with the PLO. People who sympathized with Hamas. People who sympathized with Palestinian terrorists were considered crazy lefties. Like Edward Said. But the movement of being pro-Palestine grew. And what happened in America is America began to shift slowly from being extremely pro-Israel to being still very pro-Israel, but not as much. 10 years ago, people who were pro-Palestine were about 12-13%. There was a poll that was done recently of Americans who are of Americans, asking them, are you pro-Israel or are you pro-Palestine or are you anti-Palestine, anti-Palestinian cause? And over 30% were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. That's a pretty big leap from 10 years ago. And Norman Finkelstein, he's a Jewish professor, academic, who's very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Norman Finkelstein stated about 10 years ago that American Zionism is dying. Now, is that going to happen? I think Americans will, by and large, be pro-Israel for at least a very long time. But there is a shift that is taking place nonetheless. And what we're seeing in the Western world is sympathy towards the terrorists. Now, you could say, well, a lot of the people in the Western world who sympathize with the terrorists are Muslim immigrants. And you're right, a lot of them are. I'm not going to deny that. If you look at a lot of these demonstrations. But if you look at what's happening in Ireland, what's been happening in London, what's been going on in Greece, You see the people who are pro-Palestine, they're not all Muslims. If you look at the Irish, extremely pro-Palestine. And these are white Catholics. Extremely pro-Palestine. So what's going to happen? Look at the Germans. The Germans haven't really learned that much from history. There's a lot of Germans who are pro-Israel. But there's a lot of Germans who hate Israel. Germany is the Iran of Europe. You could say that's Turkey. Oh, well, fair enough, you know. But I'll just say this. Germany is like Iran. In the sense that Germany is the only country in history that came close to exterminating the Jews. The Muslim world didn't do what the Germans did. I mean, we talk about Muslims, so let's be real here. White Germans did. Well, Germans are white. The Germans did what the Muslims never did, which is exterminate the Jews by the millions, with the intention of killing every Jew in Europe. Germany is the economic powerhouse of Europe. That's correct. And I want to show you guys some of my research. About the Germans, because I believe that the Europeans, specifically the Germans, are going to turn on the Jews. I'm going to show you guys something that I found recently. This is very fascinating stuff. So there was a paper that came out back in 2021. Well, it's a series of papers, actually, that were published in 2021. And they were published under the umbrella title of German Foreign Policy in Transition. So in Germany, they have an institute. It is called Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. German Institute for International and Security Affairs. That's the name of it. That's the name of this institution. They are very influential in the Bundestag, in the German parliament. And there is a woman in Germany who is considered to be one of the top Middle East experts in Germany. Her name is Muriel Asperg. I call her Asperg. Muriel Asperg. She wrote a paper, and she co-authored it with a Turkish analyst by the name of Hurkan Aslı Eksoy and a German analyst by the name of Wolfram Lacher. Look what she says here. She basically says that the idea of so she is very critical of Israel. She's super critical of Israel, to the point where she has even justified terrorists by saying occupied people have a right to self-defense. And she sympathizes with Palestinian terrorism. And she believes that Israel should basically be taken to The Hague for war crimes, which means that Netanyahu is a war criminal and the Israeli government is a giant... The Israeli government has committed war crimes and therefore they should be taken to The Hague and all this stuff. And she says that Germany can be a pioneer in fighting war crimes in Germany's southern neighbor, meaning the Middle East. But she specifies Israel. And she says that Germany can be a pioneer in going into its southern neighbor and stopping war criminals. And she says that Germany can even expand its police force into other countries. Guys, we're talking about the revival of German power. And we're talking about the revival of German power against Israel. I believe, and I've said this many times, that the Holocaust will happen again. And I believe that the Holocaust will happen in Israel. And I suspect, I could be wrong, but I suspect that the Germans are going to try to resume from where they left off, if you know what I mean. So I want to show you guys something here. This is what this woman wrote. Universal criminal jurisdiction. Check this out. Civil wars in the broader southern neighborhood are unlikely to give way to lasting peace if human rights violations and war crimes are not dealt with. So Germany is not only interested in Europe. Germany is interested in its southern neighborhood, meaning the Middle East. There is a need to deter potential criminals, provide victims of violence and their families with a minimum of justice, etc., etc. This is all very, typical academic talk. So she says, one feature of internationalized conflicts, however, is that prosecution by international criminal court or international special tribunals is often impossible because permanent members of the UN Security Council are involved. So she's basically saying we cannot rely on the UN to stop war criminals. And she's obsessed with Israel, by the way. She talks a lot about Israel and how Israel is full of war. Israel is committing war crimes against the Palestinians. So she's thinking of Israel. And so she's saying we can't rely on the UN to stop a war criminal country. We cannot rely on the International Criminal Court. And you know what? You really can't. When it comes to actually getting rid of war criminals and bringing them to justice, you cannot do that without really a serious military intervention. Like, and argue with me about this as you will, but NATO wanted to bring Serbia's leaders or Yugoslavia's leaders to The Hague, and that could not have happened without NATO intervention in the Balkans. Same thing with Saddam Hussein. I mean, there was no way you were bringing Saddam Hussein by just giving him a subpoena. Like, that wouldn't have worked. You had to invade Iraq to bring him into to court. Recently, or a number of years ago, they said that Omar al-Bashir, the former dictator in Sudan, needs to be brought to trial for killing millions of people and committing war crimes in Darfur. And Omar al-Bashir is still in Sudan. He's not going anywhere. So the only way that you would ever be able to bring Omar al-Bashir into trial is if you invaded Sudan and forced him. That's the only way you could do it. So she's saying that, listen, International Criminal Court, United Nations, these are basically useless when it comes to trying to bring war criminals to justice. That's what she's saying here. Germany could take a pioneering role, and this is where things get scary. Germany could take a pioneering role in several respects. First, by consistently supporting the prosecution of alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity by the ICC, wherever it has the mandate. Second, by encouraging trials under the principle of universal jurisdiction and national courts in Germany and other EU member states. So she's saying that war criminals can be brought to trial in a German court, meaning Netanyahu, who she sees as a war criminal, could be brought to trial in Germany. Now, you know how surreal that would be? That the prime minister of Israel would be brought to trial in a German court in a country that almost annihilated his people. That would be surreal. Third, by supporting court-proof documentation of war crimes by civil society and international organizations, and by expanding the capacities of its own law enforcement agencies, meaning expanding German law enforcement agencies into other countries. That sounds like the revival of the Reich. We're talking about the revival of the Reich. Such a pioneering role would correspond both to Germany's interest for lasting stability in its broader neighborhood and its interest in strengthening a rules-based multilateral world. It would entail a greater emphasis on criminal justice and thus a relocation of resources. Criminal prosecutions, especially in complex conflicts, are anything but low-hanging fruit that can be readily reaped, etc. Germany can only credibly act as a pioneer if it consistently fulfills this role. This implies that criminal prosecutions do not stop with the nationals of friendly states. For example, the ICC investigation into suspected war crimes in the Palestinian territories. Do you see where I'm going with this here? And I've said this before, that there's going to be another Holocaust. And I believe, I know that the Turks will be involved because the Turks are just itching to do a Holocaust. They love Hitler over there. Mein Kampf was a bestseller over there. And I think that because the Germans were the only country that got close to exterminating the Jews, I think that the Germans are going to try to resume from where they left off. I can be completely wrong for this. One day I could be found with serious egg in my face. But this is what I believe. This is what I suspect. And I think that the Germans are going to try to resume from where they left off in the killing of the Jews. And you see this woman, this lobbyist in Germany, Marielle Asperg. She says, oh, yes, Germany can be involved in taking war criminals into German courts. And she brings up the Palestinian territories. Why? Because there are people in Germany who want to go back to the Third Reich, and they hate the Jews. Call me some snowflake liberal for saying that, but history is one of our greatest teachers. The Turks did an extermination of the Armenian people in the First World War. The Turks lost in the First World War, and we could look back and say, well, Turkey lost, so Turkey learned its lesson. But we see Erdogan walking around with a white gown, LARPing as Alp Arslan, the guy who led the Seljuks against the Byzantines in the Battle of Manzikert. You would think they would learn from history, but they don't. People don't learn from history. One thing that we learn from history is that people do not learn from history. And so the Germans lost the first time in World War I. They tried a second time. Now, World War I was pretty devastating. The fact that they tried to do it a second time is pretty delusional on their part. The Turks tried to exterminate all the Armenians. And what are the Turks doing right now? Killing the Armenians, using the Azeris as a proxy. History rhymes. The future rhymes with history. And we see history in a way repeating itself in different ways, but nonetheless, it's there, right? The principle is there. So we could say, well, the Germans will never do this again. You could have said that after World War I, and guess what? People were saying that after World War I. Oh, this will never happen again, and it did happen again. And you see this. You see people in Germany who hate Israel so much that they will side with the Palestinians. And what happened in 1947? German Wehrmacht and SS commandos went to Palestine to side with the Palestinians, or side with the Arabs, I should say, against the Jews. It's still there, guys. It's still there. It's not just the Islamic world. There's a lot of Europeans, white Europeans, who hate the Jews. And it goes back to what the Bible said. What does the Bible say? I will make Jerusalem into a trembling cup. I will make Jerusalem a stumbling block for the world. People can say, well, the reason why so many people care about Israel is because of the Bible. You know, it's because of the Abrahamic religions. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So Islam is inspired by the Old Testament, so they have this attachment to Jerusalem. Judaism obviously has a strong attachment to Jerusalem. The Christianity still has the Old Testament, so Christians are fixated on, they're fixated on Israel. So that's the reason why. But the thing is that you have people who are atheists who are obsessed with Israel. Norman Finkelstein. You have, what's his name? Jeremy Corbyn. You have Barnaby Rain. I mean, there's a lot of people who aren't Christian who are obsessed with Israel. You have European Catholics who are obsessed with this stuff, and Catholics don't give a damn about Zionism or anything like that. But they side with the Palestinians. It's a trembling cup. And what does the book of Zechariah tell us? That anyone who uplifts Jerusalem will be cut to pieces. And that is something that you can see in the Crusades. The Catholics were obsessed with Israel. They wanted to retake Jerusalem and all this stuff. And what happened to the Crusades? They didn't last. I mean, they lasted, but it was pretty miserable. It wasn't really that successful. You could say, well, the First Crusade was successful. Sure, the First Crusade was successful, but it went downhill. And it came to the point where you had Catholics from France in Constantinople raping Greek Christians and butchering Greek Christians. So it eventually escalated to the point where it wasn't just Christian fighting Muslim. It was supposed Christian barbarians who weren't Christian at all, who were only, they were Christian in name, and they were butchering the Greeks. They were butchering the Greeks. So the way I look at it is you have immense divide in Israel between the Jews. You have vicious, murderous hatred coming from Turkey against the Israelis, against the Jews. You have Germany, which is very powerful economically speaking, and which is aspiring to becoming militarily very powerful in Europe. And remember, recently the Germans stated, we want to have the ability to wage war. They want to wage war, these people. And you could say, well, Germany is one country, it's weak. Germany is the economic powerhouse of the EU. There's 500 million people living in the EU. You're telling me that the EU cannot form a formidable army? You can't possibly believe that. There's a lot of people living in the EU. It's 500 million people. 500 million people. Meanwhile, you have the rise of the far right in Europe, which is very anti-refugee. So it's going to be very ugly, I think. And I think that you will see the massacre of the Jewish people. It's going to be another Holocaust, a genocide of the Jewish people in Israel. In the midst of that, you're going to have Jews killing one another. You could say, well, that sounds illogical. Well, that's what happened during the Judean-Roman War. The Romans were fighting the Judeans, but the Jews were killing each other at the same time. In the midst of the war, the Jews were murdering one another. And you can argue that the Jews were more brutal towards each other in many ways. In many instances, the Jews were very brutal towards each other. They butchered each other like cattle. And so I think that the future is going to mirror the past in some ways. And those are my thoughts on that.